Hello, my name is Christopher Muir and I'm a PhD student studying operations research at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and I will be presenting some of my work on the dynamic node packing problem. Node packing is a fundamental combinatorial optimization problem that asks for on input of a graph what is the highest valued subset of non-adjacent nodes. The dynamic model we present in here generalizes the deterministic version by, instead of assuming we are given an edge set up front, we are only given edge probabilities. That is, for each pair of nodes ij, we assume we are given a probability pij that corresponds to the chance that in a realization of our graph, the nodes I and j are connected by an edge. This corresponds to our packing process in that what's going to happen is we're going to select a currently uncovered node, add that node to our packing, and then sample all of the edges adjacent to that node as independent Bernoulli random variables with their corresponding probability. And what we're interested in are coming up with rules for selecting nodes that will maximize the expected value of our resulting packing, either in terms of cardinality or weight. This can be formally stated as a Markov decision process, in which our states are all subsets of the initial node set V. State S represents that at the current point, all the nodes in S remain uncovered, and those outside of S are covered or part of the packing. And what we want to know is, at state S, we want to pick the node I that maximizes this given expression, which is just the weight of the node I plus the expected value of the node packing over the nodes that will remain uncovered after sampling all of the edges adjacent to I. A natural question is, how hard is this problem? It is clear that it is NP hard in general, as it contains deterministic node packing as a special case. However, it turns out it can actually make problems trivial in the deterministic case much harder. As shown here, we are able to show that this problem in the dynamic case is NP hard for star graphs via a reduction from the partition problem. And the intuition behind this is, in the dynamic case, essentially what you're trying to do is figure out a subset of the leaf nodes that you want to take before trying to take the root node. For the remainder of this presentation, we're going to discuss the results of a polyhedral study for the DNP. Essentially what we were trying to do is we were looking at the achievable probabilities polytope Q, which is a projection of the policy LP just into the space of node probabilities. And while Q remains intractable itself to optimize over, we looked at simple relaxations, specifically Q edge and Q bilinear, which are essentially probabilistic equivalents or variants of the deterministic or formulations of the deterministic node packing problem. And it turns out both of these relaxations are actually quite weak in that they both scale linearly with input size. So what we want to do is look at classes of cuts that we can essentially add to our Q edge formulation to make it stronger and ideally get a better upper bound from it. The first class of cuts we're going to look at come from paths and cycles. Paths are one of the few cases in which a brute force dynamic programming approach can actually solve the problem efficiently. This has to do with the fact that all the states that we're actually going to have to recurse over are just the subpaths contained in the path. And there are only a quadratic number of subpaths, which that essentially just comes from the fact that a subpath is just defined by a pairing of two nodes in the path. The recursion for that is shown on this slide. And essentially, since we have a efficient recursion, that means that we can, given a point z, which is just a probability assignment for all of the nodes in the path, we can use the LP formulation, the linear programming formulation of our DP recursion, to generate a cut if z is not feasible. And this cut is just the Farkash cut. You essentially just look at the Farkash dual of the problem and then use that to verify whether or not it's feasible or generate a cut. And this general approach is extendable to cycles, as essentially a cycles actually just have the same number of states as the path will. The next class of constraints we're looking at arise from what we refer to as probability cliques. We define a probability clique essentially as the probabilistic analog of a standard clique, in that we have n nodes, each of them nodes being mutually adjacent with the same probability. This is another case where a simple recursion can solve the problem exactly for that clique. That recursion is shown here, and essentially just functions by the up to relabeling. We know all of the nodes are the same, so we only really need to care in the recursion about after we select a node, how many nodes will be left in our clique, i.e. what is the size of the subclique we'll be looking at. So since we can solve this efficiently, that sort of implies a type of constraint or cut we want to add to the problem, which is just we sum over all the nodes in some pre-identified clique, and just say that it has to be their total probabilities is less than the expected value of the D and P over the corresponding probability clique. And a fortunate result of this approach is that it actually turns out that if we look at these, we go ahead and at the beginning say we find a bunch of cliques and add this type of constraints to the model to strengthen Q edge, we can actually separate efficiently over all of the subcliques contained in our initial clique. And even beyond that, we have some sense that these are strong cuts, as it turns out all of these subclique and clique constraints are actually facet defining in the general case, under a very slight assumption that none of the nodes outside of the clique are adjacent to every node within the clique with probability 1. So in my remaining time, I'm going to discuss some of the results of a computational study we performed. The computational study essentially tested how these path, cycle, and clique constraints strengthened the Q edge formulation. We generated instances from two types. First, we got dense instances using a random graph model, where essentially we used the Erdős-Rényi model to generate a graph topology, then assigned uniform edge probabilities. We considered graphs with 100 nodes and unit weights in this case. And then for sparse instances, what we were doing is we looked at binary trees of depth 6, which have 127 nodes, the uniform edge probabilities. And then in this case, the randomness in the structure comes from random weight assignments, where all the weights were selected to between 1 and 10. Here are some summary results for the first type of experiments using the random graphs. I'll try to describe what's going on here in the table. Each row in that corresponds to the average over one particular assignment of edge probabilities. The instances that are being averaged here are, so we generated graph topologies using 0.5, 0.75, and 0.9. And then we would assign whatever the particular row's probability is to all of the edges that appear. For each particular of those combinations, we then used 10 instances. And then, so this is the average. Each element in each row corresponds to an average over 30 instances for the particular result. What the columns represent are, we have first Q edge, that's just optimizing over that simple edge-based relaxation we presented. Paths and cycles were that Q edge strengthened by using path and cycle cuts, which came from just generating 200 random paths of maximum length 10 within the graph. And then, if possible, doubling back to the first node to make it a cycle. The clique column corresponds to, we generated 100 maximal cliques greedily and then separated over those. P, C plus C, that is just all of both the paths and cliques, just done simultaneously. And then here over sim, that column is just the result of a simple degree-based heuristic simulated. And all these are presented as multiples of a simulation-based bound, where essentially we just generated for each particular graph 100 deterministic instances of the node packing problem and just solved those exactly and then averaged those. The main takeaway from these results are essentially that we see that while overall our bound is best when the graph is less dense, we see that our clique constraints are actually able to cut down the bound by quite a lot, particularly when the graph is dense, nearly 50% in that case. We see it ranges between 6 and 8, 8.3 for just the Q edge base, but then the clique takes us down to approximately 3.8 to 4.5. For our sparse results, here's the summary for the binary trees, where everything is very similar. The only major difference here is we don't have any clique or cycle cuts, because obviously there are no cliques or cycles in the binary tree. However, for the binary tree, we have the path column corresponds to, we were able to, as this was a binary tree, we could actually just enumerate all the maximal paths. Those just correspond to different pairs of terminal nodes. So we were able to do this cut generation chain over all the paths, and we can actually see we're able to cut down the result quite a bit, while overall the Q-edge formulation gives a better bound here. Between 9 and 3%, we see we're able to cut that down all the way to between like 1 and 1/10%. So finally, in summary, we, in this presentation, introduce a novel dynamic model of node packing, and we present a polyhedral study that motivates cuts based around cliques, paths, and cycles, and we see that these are particularly helpful for dense and sparse instances, respectively. And for future work, we would like to continue to identify different polyhedral results that may be able to help further reduce these gaps even more. One particular promising area would be clause.